So thanks for joining me. As noted, we are talking about the West and kind of how the West was settled by the white and black people moving west out of kind of the other side, our side of the Mississippi River. So let's see if I can stumble over my words anymore and get started. The settlement of the West begins during the middle of the Civil War. Lincoln passes 3 unprecedented, incredible laws during the war promoting westward movement. First of them is the Transcontinental Railroad Act. Basically speaking, the U.S. government owns all of the land in the West and can do whatever it wants with it. So, Congress decides, we are going to trade this land for a railroad. You build this railroad out. There's 2 companies building the railroad, Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. Y'all build this railroad. You meet each other somewhere in the middle, okay? For every mile of track that you build, we're going to give you X number of acres of land next to the train tracks. Now, you're like, why does the railroad company want land? That doesn't make sense. Well, the fact is, they don't want land. They want to sell the land, all right? Now, think about this. You're a farmer moving out to the West. Do you want to live 100 miles in the middle of nowhere, or do you want to live close to the railroad tracks? Hopefully, you guys have figured out you want to live close to the railroad tracks. Why? Well, number 1, you can get out of there if you want to. But number 2, that's how you're going to actually get the crops you grow sent to the consumers who will pay top dollar for them. Land near the railroad tracks was going to be valuable. And the United States government basically gives that land to the railroads. They say, here, listen, you get these patches of land close to the railroad. In return, you build the railroad. Think about what that did. Did the land cost the United States government anything? Nope, not a penny. Is building a railroad expensive? You betcha. Okay, you're talking like 4 years of work, 24 hours a day to build this freaking railroad across the country with giant bridges and railroad trestles and all this other kind of crazy stuff. It's super expensive to build a railroad. And the government just got it done for free. Lincoln's government gets it done for free. That's crazy, okay? What's crazier? The Morrill Act. How about college for everybody for free? Doesn't cost you a thing, doesn't cost the government a thing. Sounds like a pretty great deal, right? Why don't we do that today? The original Morrill Act gave land to each of the states. So Ohio got a bunch of land out in like Colorado or Wyoming or Nebraska, okay? And Ohio got to sell off pieces of that land specifically to fund a college, okay? What they called these were the land grants. The government granted land to the states. The states sold the land, and then the money from the sale was used to fund higher education in your state. Basically speaking, if you think about any college in the United States, any public college in the United States that has a good football program, they were probably a Morrill land grant university. Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio State, Michigan State, Penn State, all of these, LSU, Bama, all of these were land grant colleges where the government gave these states land, the states sell off the land, and then they use that money to pay for the higher education in their state. Somebody once told me, if you go to a college with your state's name in it, it was probably part of the Morrill Act. Homestead Act, and again, cost the government nothing. It cost the government nothing to give a free college education to anybody who wanted it. Cost nothing to build the most expensive railroad on planet Earth. And finally, the next thing is the one that I think is kind of the most amazing out of these. Now again, not amazing for everyone. Not amazing if you're one of the Native American nations. Homestead Act. One of the things the United States government wants to do is turn all those territories between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean into states. They want statehood out there. They want to be able to govern that land. In order to get statehood, a state has to have a minimum number of residents. How do you get people to move out there? Well, how about you just give them land for free? That's what the Homestead Act did. It traded American land. We're going to trade land that the government owns to people. In return, what do? You had to live there for 5 years. You had to make improvements. So you had to make a well, put up a windmill to run your pump. You had to farm most of the land, start some irrigation. You improve the land, you live on it for 5 years, it's yours forever for free. There aren't many deals like that, guys. I'm telling you. As a person with a mortgage, I'll be paying off until what hair I have left is gray. That is a hell of a deal, all right? Not one of these things cost the government a red cent. And what did it do? It gave a way to get out to the West with the Transcontinental Railroad, a reason to go out to the West with the Homestead Act, and a reason for the eastern states to support it with the Morrill Act. These were all passed the same year. They are 3 of the most consequential laws ever passed by a U.S. Congress, ever signed by a U.S. president. If Lincoln hadn't won the Civil War, we would still look on him as one of the great presidents for these 3 laws alone. So, that's what starts things. Now, how does it actually fill up? First of all, the West is not going to fill up until after the Civil War. The war really takes the oxygen out of the room. The war ends up consuming a lot of lives, a lot of money, and a lot of time. After the war is when the settling of the West really takes off. So, as mentioned before, land right next to the railroad becomes worthwhile. Farm it and you can easily ship your goods to market. And we find what we call railroad towns sprout up across the Great Plains. Towns like Omaha, North Platte, Denver, they start out at Salt Lake City. They're going to start out as railroad towns, okay? Towns where the railroad comes through, towns that are important because of the railroad alone. Union Pacific Railroad builds from east to west. They start in Nebraska and build towards Utah. Most of the guys working on the Union Pacific are Civil War veterans and a lot of Irish immigrants. So guys who fought in one army are now in a new army building a railroad. Irish immigrants, the ones that couldn't find a job out in the factories in the East Coast, now they're working on the railroad. And when you go through a lot of towns in Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa, you'll find that a lot of towns are going to be called like Shamrock and O'Shaughnessy and McKesson. They're going to have Irish names because of all these Irish that worked on the railroad. Now, coming the other way, off the Pacific Ocean, starting in Sacramento, California, going through the Sierra Nevada mountains, coming through the Rockies, and going out into the plains is the Central Pacific Railroad. They are bringing through Chinese immigrants. If you remember earlier in this class, we talked about how the Irish and then the Italians and the Poles, they're going to be the cheap labor that Eastern factories bring in to just do grunt work that nobody else will do for very little money. Over in California, that's the Chinese workers who are being brought in to do it. And just like the Irish are building the railroad coming the one way, the Chinese are building the railroad coming the other way. It's the first major wave of Asian immigration in American history. And that's a really big deal. And to this day, if you go through and follow the Central Pacific Railroad up into Nevada, across into Utah, you will still find Chinese populations in those states that date back to the 1860s, 70s, and the building of the railroad. Many of these railroad workers stay out in the areas that they build, and they shape the culture of those states in the middle of the map. Here kind of shows that map. Here's the Union Pacific, starting in Omaha, coming across Nebraska, across Wyoming, in Utah, and the Central Pacific, starting out here in Sacramento, coming through Nevada into Utah. Next, you've got the homesteaders. Okay, now there's a way to get out there with the railroad. Now you've got the homesteaders with the Homestead Act. Hundreds of thousands of poor people and immigrants trek west to claim land. One of the cool things about the Homestead Act, you did not have to be a guy to get it. Women could claim Homestead Act land too. And it's one of those rare laws at this point in history that applies equally to men and women. Only things you had to do. You had to make improvements to the land. You had to live there for 5 years to get your permanent deed, as we already discussed. Now, remember, what was America's goal? Filling in the middle of the map with states. What did we get? In a 30-year period, 10 new states were admitted to the country. Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada. North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, all become states. Boom, 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 in this time. The other thing happening at this time, you remember that gold rush we talked about in 1849 in Northern California. Now there are going to be more metal rushes for silver, gold, copper, and other metals that are going to keep driving that migration west. Now, I said at the beginning, some of the most consequential laws in American history, not the best laws for everybody. And in fact, the worst laws to happen to our First Nations, to our Native nations. The West was home to some of the most diverse Native American nations left at that point. You had the Pueblo people down in the Southwest, the Shoshone in the mid-mountains, like up in Idaho, Montana, going over the border into Washington State. You had the Pomos on the California coast, the Chinook up in the Pacific Northwest. Again, if we look at a tribal map and you think about everything basically from here over, Sioux, Pawnee, Arapaho, Cheyenne, the Crow, Comanche, Utes, Paiutes, Shoshones, Nez Perce, Yakimas, Chinook, Pomos, Chumash, Navajo, Pueblo, Apache. These are some of the most iconic Native nations that we know about. I say those names, and a lot of those tribe names you knew. Among them that we're really going to talk about specifically are the Plains people, especially the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho. Most of the Plains nations shared similar characteristics, and the most important characteristic they shared was the centrality of the bison to their life. Yes, a lot of these people were growing crops. They had already started growing crops to a small degree, but they still used hunting the buffalo as their primary means of a lifestyle. The buffalo, it was often said, Native peoples used everything but the grunt, which was a joke, right? Buffalo grunt. If you've never heard them, it's like... Actually, I'm kind of doing it wrong because I sound more like a pig snorting than just kind of this grunt that a bison makes. And the joke was the grunt was the only thing they didn't use because every other part of the bison got used for something. The hides got used for housing. When you think about teepees, the teepee was not canvas on the outside. That was bison leather out there. The meat was used for food. Bison is really tasty meat. Bison heads were used for religious ceremonies. Their bones were turned into weapons. Their fur was turned into lining for their clothing. But after contact with whites, the Plains nations get increasingly reliant on Western technology. Horses, metal goods, guns, swords. These become more important than the old ways of life. Here's a diagram kind of showing all the different parts of the buffalo that got used, and you can see just a million different things. The brains, tannin in the brains was used to prepare a hide. So you use the chemicals of a buffalo brain to prepare the hide to be turned into leather. Tongue was the best part of the meat. The beard could be used as an ornament on a weapon. The hair was used for headdresses and stuff. Hooves, you grind down a hoof and it turns into glue. You can turn it into a form of glue. The stomach could be used as a bucket. Basically, a stomach is a big watertight bag, and it's got two holes on it. So you sew one of them up, and the other hole on a stomach becomes like a water bag and stuff. They were ingenious in the way that they used every piece of the bison. Now, 1850 to 1870, and again, look at those dates because they're important. We're looking at right before the Civil War to right after the Civil War. During this 20-year period around the Civil War, Indian policy is concentrating natives, okay? Native nations signed treaties, and the treaties kept them within these vaguely defined borders. And the idea was, we're going to stop tribal warfare between the different nations, and we're going to try and keep Indian life in existence. It was not a policy of extermination yet, as we're coming into 1870. The treaties that the American government signed recognized the native nations, as sovereign countries. But the treaties were also one-sided. Under no circumstance could the natives break a treaty, but the United States government could break a treaty at any point, for any reason they wanted. And this is going to end up leading to native uprising in places like Sand Creek in Colorado, the Red River War, Wounded Knee, Little Bighorn in the 1870s. All of these very violent clashes, most of which are sparked by American forces, American settlers, all of these things, especially Little Bighorn, which is Colonel Custer getting his whole unit wiped out, which I hope you've heard the story of by this point in your life. These are going to lead to a change in American Indian policy. Instead of fighting all of these battles against natives, what if we go with a new strategy? So, that new strategy has a couple points. One of them is called the DAWES Act. The DAWES Act basically sets up the reservation system. And it says, look, we're not going to just concentrate people in one area and come up with some borders between your nations. We're going to fence off a place, and this is the reservation. This is where you're allowed to live. These are fixed borders. You're not allowed to leave. Nobody else is allowed to come in. This is your reservation. It's kept for you. Now, the DAWES Act goes another step further, and it says, within the reservation, we're going to break it up into property lines. Property lines are something native cultures had never had before. If you think back to the beginning of the class, we talked about how native nations, most of them did not believe that a person could own land. The land belongs to the earth. We're here for 60, 70 years tops. Doesn't belong to us. Belongs to the earth. Okay? In Western culture, that land belongs to me. This is my phone and my hat and my garage and my land. The natives had no concept of private property ownership. And when you break it up into private plots and you scatter people where, you know, Navajo family X lives here, Navajo family Y is a half mile down the road, Navajo family Z is another mile down the road, you break up the essence of tribal life. You break up communal life. In the past, everybody lives together. They share the duties. They share the duties of hunting. They share the jobs of processing. They share their food. They share around the fire. They share childcare. If somebody's killed, the community shares the family. And now you've broken that up. You've taken a societal structure that has worked for thousands of years and blown it up. All right? This is where Indian policy in the United States goes from really bad to what you can accurately describe as genocidal. All right? Then we start forcing assimilation of native nations. So people in Washington decide, we're not messing around anymore. We're just going to turn the Indians white. All right? We're going to just destroy this culture, make it go away. So they start these things called Indian schools in the East. And there were Indian schools all over on our side of the Mississippi. Most famous one was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And in these Indian schools, the United States government literally kidnapped children from families and said, Sioux family X, we're taking away all three of your children. We're going to turn them white in the East. They bring them to the East. They take the kids for their entire childhood to be re-educated, to learn the English language, to learn how to write, to learn arithmetic, learn American culture, and so on and so forth. And basically, the way they described it at the time was we're going to take the Indian out of the Indian. It gets worse. After those Indian wars, after those battles like Little Bighorn, the United States government decides we're not messing around anymore. We are going to just eliminate the population. William Tecumseh Sherman, the great leader of the Union Army in the Georgia campaign. Sherman is asked if he's asked if he wants to be in charge of Indian removal. He says no thanks, but he gives him this piece of advice that we'll talk about in a minute. He is also recruited to run for president, and he sends, I think, the best telegram of all time, which says, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. He had absolutely no interest in being president of the United States, which automatically makes him smarter than Ulysses Grant was. Sherman said, kill the buffalo and you kill the Indian. All right? Here's what he meant. Plains Indian culture, as we've already established, relied on the buffalo for food, shelter, clothing, weapons, most importantly, religion. Okay? So much of Plains Indian culture came back to the buffalo. And what Sherman realized, and it's awful that he said it out loud and the policy was pursued. If you ever find a group of people who are completely dependent on one natural resource, you don't need to go to war with those people. You just need to get rid of the resource. Now, some of you are sitting at home going, man, were they stupid? How could they be so dumb as to be completely reliant on one resource? And I would say to you, oil. You are completely dependent on oil, and so am I. It's how we get from place to place in our cars, right? With gasoline. But it's also how all of our food gets to the markets. If all of a sudden somebody made it impossible for us to use gasoline and diesel in this country, food doesn't get from farms to the grocery stores, and we starve. Okay? Think about this. Plastics. Plastics are made out of oil. They're made out of petroleum. If that's gone, plastics don't get made anymore. Medicines, fertilizers that we use on fields, many of them go back to petrochemicals, petroleum chemicals. You take out oil, you take out our society. We are completely dependent on that one resource. The Sioux weren't the idiots. We're the idiots. We're the ones who are completely reliant on one resource and have failed to learn history's lessons. Sherman realizes if you wipe out the buffalo herds, the Sioux lifestyle is crushed. They have nothing. You win. And that's exactly what the Americans do. They slaughter the buffalo herd. In 40 years, the buffalo herd in the Great Plains goes from 60 million to about 100. It's a miracle there were 100 buffalo left. It is a greater miracle that today there are hundreds of thousands of bison roaming around on the Great Plains, that they've been restored to a large degree. And that's really only happened in the past 25 years. And again, it's incredible that it's happened at all. This picture here is one of the ones that always almost gives me nightmares. The U.S. government paid people to go out and kill buffalo. They had train excursions where a train would go out with, 5-6 train cars on it, and the train would be filled with hunters. And the train would drive out into the Great Plains, and these guys would just shoot from the windows of the train or get off the train by a little bit and fire away into these herds of buffalo to kill as many as they could. They would let the meat rot or they would burn the meat. What you are looking at here is a mountain of buffalo skulls. Think about how many skulls alone. This is not leg bones and this and that. This is skulls. How many skulls do you need to get a mountain of skulls that's probably, eyeballing it here, 30 feet high? That's crazy. Now, back on the ranch. The soil in the Great Plains, once you broke it up, once you got under the grass, the great grasslands out there, once you broke it up, it was great soil, okay? It was fertile. You could grow just about anything in it. And the dominant crop out there becomes wheat. Now, wheat, I hope you're aware, we grow wheat, we harvest it, and then the stuff that we harvest gets dried out, ground up, made into flour, made into bread, made into noodles, and so on and so forth. Lots of things are made out of wheat. Machines made it increasingly easy to plant and harvest, which we're going to talk about in another video. Lots of machines made in places like Toledo, Ohio, and around the rest of the Midwest are going to make it easier to plant wheat. They're going to make it easier to dig up the dirt, easier to plant seeds, easier to harvest it. Everything's going to become easier with machines. But down in Oklahoma and Texas, western Kansas, western Nebraska, there's really not the ability to plant wheat. So out there they have grasslands, and the grasslands are good for grazing. Grazing is having cattle that just kind of roam around and eat the grass and get fat, and then you kill them and you eat steaks. So we see large cattle operations crop up to harvest the beef. And I really encourage you to think about meat as being harvested just like other crops are harvested. When we use harvest, a lot of times we think of a combine out getting corn or grain out of a field. But animals get harvested too. If you catch 20 fish on a good weekend and you clean the fish to serve a meal for your family, you just harvested fish. You harvest chickens or you harvest deer. And on a cattle farm, they're harvesting beef. This is where cowboys come into American life, and the cowboy is an important figure in American life. Cowboys were poor dudes who worked for ranchers, and the job of a cowboy was simply to move all these cattle from one place to another. Okay, move them out. You know, they're born. Now you move them out on the grasslands. You get them fat for a few years. They reach the peak weight, peak age. Now the cowboys have to take all those cattle and move them close to the railroad, where they can get slapped onto rail cars, sent to Chicago, where the slaughterhouses were. And in the Chicago slaughterhouses and the like Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Green Bay slaughterhouses, that's where the meat packing industry was. The meat packing industry was slaughterhouses. Okay, they kill the animals as soon as they get there, put the carcass up on a hook. The hook comes through what becomes a factory of killing, and keep in mind, guys, I'm not vegetarian. I love me some meat, so I'm not trying to sound nasty here or like some kind of crusading, vegetarian. I'm just saying what it is. It's a machine, a factory of death. Carcasses come through. They hack a piece off. The meat cutters do their thing to make a side of beef. The sides of beef get put onto these brand new inventions called refrigerated railroad cars, and they get shipped east. Changes the diets of everybody in the United States. Very few people used to eat meat before the 1880s. Now today, I would guess that a lot of you probably had meat this week served for dinner in your family. Takeaway from all of this. For the white settlers going west, this creates an archetype called rugged individualism. Okay? The idea that we went out there by ourselves with no help from anybody at all, and we carved an existence out of the wilderness. We were the only ones. Nobody did anything for us. We made this happen all alone, by ourselves. Western settlers are seen as not needing anything but personal strength and courage. Now, we can talk for a moment about how that is a complete fabrication, right? How did they get out west? Because the government gave them land for free. How did they actually make that trip? Many of them on railroads that were paid for with land by the government. Okay? When their children grew older and little Johnny was pretty smart, they sent him to a college that was free from the government. Okay? This was not a bunch of people who just decided, you know what, let's all go west and we'll create our own existence. This was a specific plan paid for by the United States government to get people out there. They did not create these things themselves. Yes, I'm sure they showed plenty of personal courage. I'm sure they were good parents and fine farmers. But the rugged individualism is largely a myth. Yes, these were rugged people. They did not do it alone. They did it with significant help. Now, for native nations, the end is in sight. And the next time we come back to the West, we're going to be talking about the fall of the Old West and how things really fall apart out on the plains, especially for the native nations. And this long story that we've told since the very beginning of this class, back in August and September, this long story about native peoples getting pushed further into shrinking areas. That story's going to come to an end the next time we come back to the West. So, thanks for sticking with me, you guys. As always, be well.